Hello, welcome once again to Justice Conversations from the Ivory Tower to the Street with Dr. Brian O'Neill, Luis Suave Gonzalez, and our guest today is Richie Schultz, who is going to be talking about toxic masculinity. First of all, I'd like to ask you a little bit, Richie, about how and why you became well versed in this subject.
Yeah. So thanks for having me, first and
I guess
foremost.
defining it too would be a good thing.
Yeah. So defining and how I got into this work. I'm a Northeast Philly boy, born and raised. Spent all of my life in and around the area, and I generally tell my story in three parts. First is that I was politicized, or my revolutionary birthday happened around the Ferguson uprising. So as a white man, that was when I really started waking up and learning about white supremacy, patriarchy, all of those sorts of things, and taking action around the ways in which we live in just a deeply unfair and unequal society. And From that work, I got involved in some grassroots community organizing with white folks or like allied identity people around what does it look like to do multiracial political organizing that's trying to challenge structures of white supremacy, racism, police brutality, the prison system. And it was through doing some of that work that I got connected to an organization called Reconstruction Incorporated up in North Philadelphia, and started doing some training on the inside with some of the long-timer and lifer ladies at SCI Muncie. And in doing that sort of work, I realized some of the relationships between racism and patriarchy and the ways in which survivors of domestic violence also get criminalized and incarcerated for the ways in which they survive domestic violence.
We should mention Muncie is a female institution.
Yeah, thank you. And So I started paying a lot more attention to the ways in which our prison systems and masculine and male patriarchal violence are really deeply connected. And at the same time I was doing that work, someone in my nuclear family was raped by a friend. And so I wanted to figure out how to answer the question of how do we hold and heal from that harm that was caused without reinforcing the same patterns of male domination and violence. Because, my father could wanted to find this guy and drop him off a building, and I also know that that wasn't going to actually solve the problem or bring healing to my family member who was hurt. And so that's when I really started getting curious about this idea around toxic masculinity, what's going on with all of that, what can we as men do in order to end male violence, which brought me into my current gig, which is at Lutheran Settlement House, which is a domestic violence agency here in Philadelphia, where I work as a trainer to teach professionals, community members, any and all folks around how to support survivors of domestic violence, as well as coordinate a campaign called the Masculinity Action Project, which is trying to reframe domestic violence, which is traditionally seen as a women's issue, as something that men not only can, but need to take a stand on and to organize for gender justice if we want to actually make violence unimaginable in our communities. So that's kind of how I came to this work. And then for me, I would say that toxic masculinity is a certain it's a particular set of cultural attitudes that we learn living in American society about what it means to be a man, where what it means to be a man and what masculinity is associated with aggression and violence and needing to push and get as much sex as possible and to not show emotions aside from anger and dominance. And I think that we sometimes talk about this as the act like a man box, which comes from a mentor of mine, Paul Kivel, around this is what it means to be a man, and when you step outside of those particular sets of attitudes and behaviors, you get called a fag or a sissy or gay or any and all of those sorts of things. And I think that a lot of violence that we see in society stems from that sense of what it means to be a man. So, yeah.
I mean, I've done some research. I'm not an expert on this topic, but I've done some research, and I just want to read to the people that's listening to us, man, because you know where I come from. I come from incarceration, where toxic masculinity is like in the front line. But what I'm blown away to really pinpoint nowadays that white supremacy and toxic masculinity is like the prime reason that we seen this mass incarceration boom. Because the way people perceive brown and black people. And what is your opinion on that, or your views on that?
Could you say that one more time? Like,
White supremacy and toxic masculinity is probably the prime reason why we're seeing a boom in mass incarceration. Because of the way other people view Latinos and black people, or perceive us to be.
yeah, absolutely. And so I would offer, going back to that man box, what it means to act like a man. Growing up in this society, everyone learns those same sorts of values. No one can actually fit into all of the behaviors and attitudes of what it means to be a man. And also at the same time, I get away with a lot more of what that looks like than as a white man than black and brown folks, right? So if I sexually assault someone, or if I was to murder someone, or just abuse someone, that's a momentary lapse in judgment where I get to be rehabilitated. Whereas if that happens to a black or brown person, they're violent and they're a monster, and we need to throw them away and put them in a cage because they need to be controlled. And so I think that, like, just taking, for instance, like our president right now has a history of sexual assault, abuse, is a rapist, and he's running our country. Whereas if Barack Obama, had 3 wives or something like that, there's no way he would have been able to become president.
He's also in town right now, so maybe we'll hear this.
Oh, Barry O, how you doing? And yeah, absolutely. And there's a piece in that too around the conditioned entitlement that comes with masculinity, where it teaches us to be violent with each other, and it teaches us to in responding to conflict, to do so with domination. And just like the ways in which black men and brown men specifically get seen as hyper violent is one of the ways in which we justify the continued building of our prison system.
And that's a problem. And that's a big problem, because even in our school system, people view blacks and Latinos as, you have to be physically strong and able to qualify for this. We are not seen for our intellectual skills. We are seen for our strength. That means you can play football, you can play basketball. And I say to that our people are built to be lawyers, doctors. We just don't go to school to play basketball, and that's the way other people see us. And that's the problem, because now I fail in my scholarship. I have nothing else but to use my strength to survive in the street. And coming from the communities that I come, toxic masculinity is a must. I'm stronger than you. That means I'm going to take what I want from you, right? Because I'm thriving off that power that I got, that I could beat you the hell up, that I could take you under, that I could do whatever I want to you.
Yeah.
And that, to me, is a problem. So my question to you is, where do the white supremacy, right, come into the toxic masculinity, and why are so many people and positions view minorities in that way?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I just want to circle back to the prison piece before touching on that, around the culture of toxic masculinity, which is to dominate, to force yourself on, to punish, to hurt, to be extraordinarily aggressive, is the same system of prisons. When you act out of line, I'm going to, through punishment, force you into a cage and to act a certain sort of way. So the abusive culture of prison culture is also the same abusive culture of male domination, patriarchal gender socialization, and also the system of white supremacy. And I think that, I just like circling back on the ways in which they're interrelated, is that the man box culture was developed by white men, in terms of how we actually need to think of what it means to be a man, right? That does not work for anyone except for those few select folks in power. And the reality of the situation is, we can just look at like an issue like gun violence, right? Or mass shootings. Right now, women, Muslims, gender oppressed folks, immigrants, all of the people that our current administration wants to point its finger at as what the problem is, all of those folks have just as much access to guns as anyone else, right? And it's over 90% of the people that are committing mass shootings are male, right? And not just men, but like white men. And this is something that we already know from our own experience. So there are ways in which, at least the narrative that we get to see in the media, is that those individual white men just have like mental illness or like whatever sort of situation going on there, when the reality is that the combination of masculine conditioned entitlement that says when we don't get to feel our feelings and we need to be dominant, and the entitlement that comes with whiteness in a white supremacist society that normalizes white male violence is what allows something like mass shootings to happen on such a pervasive and epidemic level right now here in this country. And for us to be like, oh, who knows what we can even possibly do about that. We're not going to take that seriously. We're not going to develop a whole entire prison system around putting white men into cages for the ways in which we're shooting up schools and stuff like that, is one of the ways in which the normalcy of white supremacy and masculinity get just taken as an everyday fact here in this country. Yeah.
Sure. Something I would like to address, an article appeared in The Atlantic several years ago by Elijah Anderson, talks about the code of the street and respect. And it talks specifically about lower class adolescents, and especially minority adolescents, and how the avenues to gain respect through legitimate or so-called socially approved ways are limited. And so young men especially are socialized in their play and their social bonds to use aggression as a means of getting acceptance from their peers. And it gets reinforced. And so this carries all the way into adulthood. And talk about the code of the street, which refers to the idea if you're disrespected, the only appropriate response, if you want to maintain respect, is a serious violence response. I was talking to Suave before the show, like how many people are incarcerated because they felt they had been disrespected. How many people violated the terms of their parole or probation because they felt they were disrespected. And you talk to them and they might say something like, I had no choice because this dude did such and such. And so their choice of options that they see is extremely narrow because the only way they see to maintain their respect, and they're willing to even put their life on the line and their entire future to do so.
You know, I always say this, Richie, that the most destructive 3 words that any parent could tell a boy coming up is be a man. You know, those words to me, when I was told those words, it was like they gave me a license to do what I wanted to do to weaker people as I see them. And a lot of time, man, my sisters, I'm the man, you the woman, you listen to me. I shouldn't respect you at all. And we're going to continue this subject. And our next segment, we got to go on a commercial break. You listening to a Justice Conversation on Usala Radio.
I came out in the 11th grade. Nobody was embracing you. The kids were cruel. It was very difficult to be gay. Not completing high school is more of a social thing than it was an academic thing. And even though all these years have passed, I still had that longing to have my diploma. I have a mentor, Maria, and she convinced me to continue my education. She just never judges. She's a true role model.
From the depths of my heart, I thank you, Maria, for being a friend and a beautiful person. No one receives a diploma alone, and I'm honored to share this moment with you. Thank you.
If you're even considering getting your high school diploma, go get it. You can do it.
find free adult education classes near you at finishyourdiploma.org.
Because of you, I feel not alone in this world. And you let me know that it only takes one person to make you feel wanted.
Welcome back to Justice Conversations from the Ivory Tower to the Street. Dr. Brown O'Neill, Luis Suave Gonzalez, brought to you by Westchester University. And Richie Schultz is here talking about toxic masculinity. I wanted to quote from this article by Elijah Anderson that appeared in the Atlantic several years ago. In the street culture, especially among young people, respect is viewed as almost an external entity that is hard won but easily lost, and so must be constantly be guarded. The rules of the code, in fact, provide a framework for negotiating respect. So there's also a very fragile aspect to this. If somebody looks at you the wrong way, if somebody makes a comment about you, anything that might be regarded as an affront, you have to respond.
Mm-hmm.
You got no choice. And so I think that the fact it's fragile, the fact it's hard-earned, and the fact that you can easily cross the line makes this a very volatile situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to offer there, it's slightly different, but I'm thinking about what W.E.B. Du Bois talks about as one of the psychological wages of whiteness, which, like, maybe I don't have any economic security, but at least I'm not that N-word over there, right? And there is a psychological wage to masculinity as well that we see in places that also have access to less resources, particularly for like Black and brown communities that are experiencing like generational poverty, right? And just to make it explicit, the disrespect that we're talking about here is the disrespect of manhood, right? So I might not have access to a ton of money or educational privilege or good health care or any of the other things that come with economic security and wealth, but at least I have my manhood, and you can't take that away from me. And if you try to take my manhood away from me, I'm going to push back on that in order to reinforce and have my masculinity and to have my manhood. And I think that there's a complex...
And what that pushback means?
It means going to their house, right? It means going back to that playground and jumping that person, right? It means responding with violence and putting yourself back into that act like a man box and pushing them out of it, right? And there's a complexity here that I want to hold too around. I think that when we talk about masculinity and gender justice and what it looks like to actually deal with the underlying conditions that lead to this stuff, that when we look at masculinity through the prism of race, we need to understand that you can't just tell people, hey, act nonviolent or show your emotional and tender side, because there are ways in which in the different communities that we come from that can actually also lead to more violence. So we need to hold a lot of complexity, particularly when we're talking to Black and brown folks and in Black and brown communities, about the underlying and other realities of what comes in, and also in white communities as well, as like what we're actually dealing with. Because for one person to just say, hey, I'm going to act differently now, is to also potentially be met with violence. So,
You know, so how do we, me as a Latino man, you know, the social construction of masculinity demand that I prove and reprove day after day that I am a man.
mm-hmm.
You know, how do we tell a young brother that all he has in his space, community, is his manhood, and that's what's keeping him alive. That's what's supporting his family. How do we tell that young brother, like, you don't have to be that way and still survive and take care of your family? How do we move them away from that toxic masculinity to a more sensitive way of being, but still maintain their manhood in the eyes of the people that's watching?
Yeah, I appreciate the question, and I just want to say a couple of things there. One is that I wouldn't want to tell that person anything, right? And I think that part of the pattern and the issue is white men telling or demanding, particularly kids of color, how they should act and behave. And I think that there's incredible work even happening here in Philly, like with EMOC or Engaging Men of Color, around answering and figuring out that question as well. I think another question that comes up with the question that you're asking is, what does it actually look like to create safety for folks to step out of those behaviors, right? Which looks like normalizing consent-based education in our schools. It looks like allowing men to have feelings other than anger and aggression. It looks like when a young boy cries, not telling them to man up and to actually allow them to feel those feelings. It looks like changing the underlying economic conditions that lead to violence in the first place, right? So there's a one of my mentors, Tony Lapp, he quotes Harvard violence expert James Gilligan, who has found that in societies that have less income inequality, it's talked about as the Gini coefficient, there's less domestic violence, gun violence, violence in those societies. So where there is power over in our institutions, there is power over in individual relationships, and that's the root of abuse. So I believe that the pathologies of our institutions are much stronger than individual virtue. And so when we want to answer that question, we need to look at what we can do at an individual level and also look at the other underlying conditions as part of answering that question as well. We need affordable health. We need affordable housing. We need universal health care. We need supervised injection sites. We need to end gentrification. Those are things that will allow folks to step out of the really tight and rigid conditions around what it means to
Now, those are long-term things, but the short-term, I think Suave's asking too. What would he tell this young guy that doesn't want to lose face, doesn't want to get himself locked up, or in violation of probation or something else, that feels he's been disrespected?
Because it's hard, right, when you come up with an image.
Right.
That everybody respect you because of that image. People respect you because they know that if they step out of that box, that you are capable, or they believe that you will bring harm towards them. So they'd rather respect you than deal with that harm. You know,
well, I think one of the important things is the voice of reason have to come from people like you, Suave.
Yes.
Not from some, white middle-class social worker who is not going to have as much credibility, let's put it quite frankly. So I think that alone, just having a role model of somebody that's walked in those shoes, and that's another problem we should have to think about, is the absence of role models in these communities, and the absence of
and even some
older
of our
males.
role models today, even some of our role models that we see, we are prisoners. Even me, knowing about this topic and researching it and reading about it and having an interest in it, I still find myself being a prisoner of toxic masculinity every day. When I get on the train, I got to put my face on, like, don't mess with me. And that's only for safety reason. That's not the way I want to be, but it keep me safe. It keep me safe. So how do we tell a young brother out there that that's all he knows, that don't have another way of life, that's not a good way of being? Do we tell them, let your guard down and maybe get bullied or harassed? Because a lot of the time, we become prisoner of our own toxic masculinity because we feel there's outside forces is coming up on us and pressuring us, bullying us. And that's why you see bullies snapping out. And, they take with so much and they're like, I'm done. I'm going to hurt this guy. And the prison setting and the community setting, when it deals with toxic masculinity, it's the same. It's no different. In fact, the prison setting is even worse because we have to be that macho man.
All the time.
If your mother died, you can't really come out and cry on another man's shoulder like, oh, mama, because you are seen like a sissy. Mans don't cry. Remember, be a man. Them 3 words. Man up. It's always seen like 3 words in there. And what I tell people is, it's all right, man. It's all right. I know what you would do to me. But it's all right to let it out. It's all right to be sensitive. It's all right to interact with other people that you may disagree with because of their lifestyle. It's all right. There's nothing wrong with that. But in our community, because I remember when I was coming up in the early 70s, 80s, I'm not going to reveal my age, y'all. You know, we were always told that you's a man, you don't cry. If somebody hit you, you pick up a rock or a bottle and hit them. You know, if you can't beat them, you hit them with something. I remember times when I fight somebody and I be scared. My mother be like, "You're not coming in the house till you go out there and fight. Oh, I'm gonna whip your butt." And I feared that my mother's butt whipping was gonna be worse than that guy, so I'm going out there and fight.
Sure. Yeah.
You know, and to me, them values stood with me all the way to incarceration.
Sure.
Which was, I'm gonna put fear in you, so like that you won't even think about messing with me. So yes, I am a prisoner of my own toxic masculinity, even to this day.
Yeah.
I don't go around bullying people, but there's time when, you know, the chest come out and don't mess with me. You know, there's time when that happened, and that's a bad thing to do.
Can I offer?
Yes.
I just want to honor you. Answered your question there. You answered your question there of just like, I want to support someone to actually feel those feelings. So on the tip of what do we actually tell those people? We don't necessarily have to tell them anything. We can talk about ourselves and just show support there. There are questions to ask. What I'd want to do is I want to ask to someone who's afraid of showing feelings to their friend, a young man who's afraid of showing feelings to their friends, how are you feeling right now? Oh, you're feeling scared. Let's talk about that, and I'm here for you in that. I want to hold you in that. And I want to support and allow and create a culture of nurturance where we're actually normalizing and allowing men to actually have the 2/3 of emotions that we're not taught to feel, right? That's really what we need to be up to. There's a quote by a black feminist poet, Nayera Wahid, from her collection of poems, Salt, where she says, "There have been so many times I have seen a man wanting to weep, but instead beat his heart until it was unconscious." So how are we weeping with other men?
Right.
And how are we normalizing that and modeling those sort of behaviors? Because we can't just tell people what not to do. We need to model and take the risks and hold them through what we actually want, which is deep, genuine, intimate connections, emotional vulnerability, care, and nurturance. Right. And that's something that one of the other things that's really hard there is that when we ask the question of what can I do or what can I tell that person, some of the options are painfully limited. But when we start thinking of what can we do, what does it look like to bring other men involved? Who are your other friends who want to be able to be more tender with you as well? Because they're out there, right? What does it look like to bring them into this as well? That's where organizing actually comes into play. And that's what building power looks like, is building the relationships to transform that culture together.
And I suggest, man, to everybody that's watching, man, I thank everybody that's joining in our conversation. We see y'all. We're going to address your questions in a minute. Watch this documentary called The Walk. It's about prisoners in Folsom Prison in California coming together, forming this group called The Circle and addressing this issue. And I think it's powerful when you see people in prison for various crimes coming together and opening up and admitting that the reason they are in prison is because they let their toxic masculinity guide their decisions. You know,
incredibly powerful movie.
It's a powerful documentary that people should watch. Watch it, and you know, this is a conversation, man, that a lot of people don't want to have, but we having it here on the Justice Conversation. We'll be right back. We're going on a commercial break. But first, we want to say thank you to all the people that's sending their questions in. You listening to a Justice Conversation on Usala Radio.
If you love them enough to suck the snot out of their nose at 4 a.m., then surely you'll check NHTSA.gov/the right seat to make sure they're in the right car seat.
They call me Maxie, but I prefer tripod. I was your above-average four-legged homie, and then wham, bam, minivan. Some people pity me. Now that's lame. I still run, fetch, and swim. And the ladies love me. I'm the ultimate wingman. Just don't ask me to high five.
Because of you, I feel not alone in this world. And you let me know that it only takes one person to make you feel wanted.
Okay, welcome back to Just Conversations from the Ivory Tower at the Street with Dr. Brian O'Neill. Luis Suave Gonzalez and Richie Schultz is with us talking about toxic masculinity. And I wanted to also reference, you're talking about prison programs, a very innovative program. Actually, Dr. Gilligan had a lot to do with founding that one. Mm-hmm. And that's in the California and San Francisco jail system. I'm trying to remember the woman who wrote the book about that program, because I read the book, but I can't remember the names escaping me. But it's the Man Alive program, in which it targets violent offenders, and they do group work in therapy in the prison, and they allow these men to be vulnerable in the space of prison, which is quite an undertaking, but they do, because eventually becomes acceptable, and it becomes a safe place to do that. And they talk about in their therapy session, my thug self and the self I want to be. And when they talk about their thug self, they're very real about all the things we're talking about, the stereotypes of how I have to assert my masculinity and the things I had to do it. And they speak with that with some regret. But they'll talk about their thug persona and want to put that persona to rest. So that's very honest, and it causes them to reflect on things that they've done and take a lot of accountability for it. And the recidivism rate of the guys that go through the program is much lower than other violent offenders. Mm-hmm. And they also include a peer support part to that, so that after they leave, there's somebody they can call when they're in crisis, somebody that can help them, because if you just leave it go once you've left, there's going to be too many other forces working against that. So you need somebody as a safety valve to call on that's going to be there as a mentor, as a sponsor. And I thought what's most impressive about the Man Alive program is they use former residents of the facility as facilitators. Mm-hmm. They train them to run the groups. Even after they leave and after they're off parole, they come back and run these groups. And they're very well trained. They even have people sit in the trainings that are Confederates to give them a hard time to see how they react. Mm-hmm. Somebody's not cooperating, not going with the program, talking back to them. How are they going to deal with that in a group situation? So they really put them through it. But that is a huge part of that, I think, is the peer, because it gives them credibility with these guys. Because at some point during this, you know where I used to be? I used to be sitting right where you are.
Yeah.
They don't immediately disclose that, but at some point they do. And it has a lot of weight when they do that.
I think when you address topics like this, you must have somebody that's been through it.
Right.
You know, that's the only way we're going to resonate to these young brothers and sisters out here. And I think that some of our parents, and by no way we saying that Browns and Latino males are bad. What we're saying out that we are a target of toxic masculinity. And because of that, we suffered the law and justice, the criminal justice system, because some of these judges, some of these prosecutors view us in a certain way. So they feel if they hear they must have did it, I'm gonna try to convict them. And I say to you, you know, you don't have to teach your son to be a badass. You teach him to defend himself. You don't have to teach him to be a badass. Because that could have deadly consequences
Yeah.
in our community and society today.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but again, I'm gonna keep saying it to the show end. White supremacy and toxic masculinity is fueling mass incarceration
Yeah.
because people see us in a different light.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, instead of giving you 5 years, I'm gonna go for 25 years.
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna go for 25 years, and we seen that with the case that's going on today in New York with the young woman that got killed in Bernard College.
Mm-hmm.
Police immediately, we made an arrest, a 13-year-old kid. He's hyped. He got a knife on him. They automatic stereotype him as a villain without even really knowing if that person did that crime or not. But since he's black, minority, we automatically feel that you must did it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you guilty.
Mm-hmm. There are no, just to respond to that, there are no black children under white supremacy. There is no place for any sorts of mistakes. You are always already guilty, and the privilege of the presumption of innocence does not exist, and that's just a reality that we're dealing with. And I just want to pull back the frame a little bit around, because something that can happen is we can focus on like black and brown men, and there are really important questions there. But the grants get written around how to deal with toxic masculinity and healthy relationships as if black and brown men are actually the issue, when it's white men in power that have the power and the ability to have impact, and that are actually more representative of the systems of control that lead to these issues in the first place. And I just want to name and hold that as like what we're really up against in some ways. And I also want to name that like as horrible and terrifying as toxic masculinity is for men of all different racial backgrounds, and the ways in which we commit violence against each other because of it, that's in so many ways incomparable and incomprehensible compared to the violence against women, femmes, trans folks that are also because of toxic masculinity, right? I'm just thinking about there was a murder that happened in North Philly recently because there was a guy who was dating a trans woman, and it was found out about. And it's just like the reason that violence happened was because of our traditional notions of what it means to be a man, and to date a trans woman is to go against that. And to be a trans woman is to go against our traditional notions of what it means to be a man. And so it's that same toxic masculinity that leads to things like incredibly high rates of sexual violence and assault against trans women, trans folks, women, gender nonconforming people, that leads to the gender pay gap, that leads to all of these other sorts of harm. And we can't let that get out of the conversation of what we do about toxic masculinity. So I just wanted to hold that. And I also wanted to hold another piece here around, we can talk about folks that have committed really intense forms of sexism, sexual assault or abuse, who end up in prisons or who don't end up in prisons. We also, something that is happening right now with like white liberals, for instance, is we talk a lot about the Klan or the really big racists or Donald Trump and stuff like that. And what happens when we do that, and it's a labor organizer, Kelly Hayes, who talks about this. She says that we dramatize both good and bad in order to spare ourselves the labor of interrogating normalcy. And it's actually under normalcy, this is what I think you were hitting at, Suave, which is where so much of the violence happens, the ways in which we do everyday little microaggressions to act out our toxic masculinity or to perform our white supremacy. And we need to get into the where it's normalized and not seen as dramatic or violent if we actually also want to deal with the everyday violence that is just happening all of the time.
I found out something about the program I was alluding to earlier. I get more details here. San Francisco jail, it's called the RSVP program, which is called Resolve to Stop the Violence. Started in 1997. It's the first jail program in the U.S. that houses and specifically works with male prisoners who have violence documented in their criminal histories. After 16 weeks in the RSVP, there are 82% lower rearrests for violent crimes in this group. It consists of 3 parts: a man alive, which is what we're talking about here, peer-based program with gender-based analysis of violence. Then there's the survivor impact, which participants hear directly from outside presenters who have been victims of violent crime. They come in and speak. not their own victim, but to represent victims. And then restorative justice circles of support and accountability is another part of the program. So those major components, and it talks. And the website has several people talking that were graduates of the program.
And it's called the first piece
RSVP.
Man Alive. That's
Right.
incredible.
RSVP program. Yeah, it's been around since 1997.
Awesome. Wow. That's incredible work. And I think there's something else to honor in that, of just like men's work has been happening for a very long time, and just how and where is it visibilized. So,
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So let me ask you, Richard, what do you, as a person that's been doing this work for how long?
I've been working specifically in my current job doing masculinity work and gender justice work with men for a little over 2 years now.
Okay, as a person that's been working a little bit over 2 years, your experience, have people attacked you in ways like that's not manly to do it, or you shouldn't do that kind of work as it make other people look bad? Have you had that kind of backlash?
Yeah, no, like actual violence in the ways in which I experienced violence around how I would step out of the man box as a kid, and so much backlash. I mean, we got an email the other day at work around someone who was just like, women can be just as toxic as men. What are you doing about toxic femininity? And just there's always a lot of pushback, especially on the internet, of people being like, well, it's not all men who are toxic, or what about men who are survivors of domestic abuse? And I love that conversation, because Lutheran Settlement House has been supporting male survivors of domestic abuse for forever. Most of the people that give those sorts of criticisms aren't actually trying to support men that are dealing with higher rates of suicide or dealing with abuse in their, or like survivors of abuse in their intimate relationships. They're just trying to preserve the status quo, and they feel uncomfortable with the fact that we're trying to deal with these issues.
So what other programs are you involved with that we could invite people if they want to have that conversation in a larger setting, one-on-one? Do y'all provide like one-on-one for people that might want to talk about it, learn more about it, but don't want to do it in a public setting or in a group setting? Do they have that space?
Well, so I would say for people that are experiencing harm in their relationships or violence, we have free and confidential counseling that folks can get at Lutheran Settlement House. For people that aren't in that sort of situation but want to get involved in masculinity work, we do have our campaign, the Masculinity Action Project, that where we put on workshops, as well as would be happy to have one-on-one conversations with folks around what does it mean to be a man in the current political moment that is the Me Too movement? What does accountability look like? How do we build skills around interrupting our friends when they say something sexist? And then the other really big piece of the Masculinity Action Project is this, for folks that want to take a deeper dive, it's called the SOCHA program, which I could share about the name in a second. But it's a 6-month-long program that's starting in January, for men to do a lot of that inner work that happens in Man Alive around what does it mean to be a man? What did I learn about that? How does that show up in my behaviors? What works and what doesn't? And how do we learn how to care and build relationships with each other together? And then it moves from that inner work to actual outer work, of which is the real work, or no, other real important work of what does it mean to take action for gender justice? What does feminist work look like here in Philadelphia? And how can we show up accountably and collectively in that work here in Philly? So
there's one other book I wanted to mention. I finally found it. It's called Dreams from the Monster Factory by Sonny Schwartz with David Boudel. And it is about, Sonny Schwartz is one of the founders of the Resolve to Stop the Violence program, the Man Alive component to that. She runs groups in San Francisco. It was through the San Francisco Sheriff's Department that very progressively said, look, how can we make a difference in these guys' lives? Because we keep seeing the same people coming through the system constantly. And so she was one of the forerunners to help address that. Her name is Sonny Schwartz. The book is phenomenal. So I highly recommend it. It's called Dreams from the Monster Factory.
And with that, we got to go on a commercial break. You're listening to A Justice Conversation on Osala Radio.
Because of you, I feel not alone in this world. And you let me know that it only takes one person to make you feel wanted.
What do you think think you're doing, Kevin? Was just gonna drive home.
There are several warning signs present that you shouldn't be driving.
Like hearing voices?
Like your text-to-emoji ratio?
Oh man, the selfies. Selfie, nailed it.
We all have warning signs that let us know that we're probably not okay to drive. Mine is pretending to be your subconscious.
Craig, come on, man, let's split a ride home.
Our hearts are made stronger by how we treat others.
Put her there.
The light you share can impact those around you, but so can the darkness.
Later, twerps. Did Pete saying mean things bother you?
So when you reach out to another person, take a moment to consider how they will feel and let your heart be the key to making a difference. Because of you, someone's entire day, year, or even life can change.
In every heart, there's hope.
Welcome back to a Justice Conversation. You know, we got about 9 minutes, Richie.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have more information that we could share with our public? Any other program, any other group that y'all running that can be beneficial to people that's listening?
Yeah, so for men who, or masculine identified folks that are interested in, unpacking, all of these questions around gender, as well as figuring out what can I actually do about that, I can say a little bit more about our SOCHA program, which is our deep dive 6-month-long program. That's the second cohort of it starting in January. And you can find all of the information as well as dates in the application at bit.ly/SOCHA program, which is SOCHA program. So the SOCHA program brings together men for a couple different retreats over these 6 months, and has a couple different components to it. One is it starts with, as I was saying before, just exploring together as men what we learned about masculinity, how other identities around race or sexual orientation, class background play into that, and how do we want to show up and build different behaviors and answer the question that you were talking about earlier. What do we want to tell these young boys that are afraid of acting emotionally or vulnerably and all those sorts of things? We then do a deep dive into some political education around what's the history of men involved in feminist work, what does it look like to show up accountably in feminist work, what are some of the questions that we have to grapple with and deal with and what that looks like, and how do we also cultivate accountability to ourselves and in our lives to other folks. And then we get a lot into concrete organizing skills around what are different theories of social change and how does social change happen? How do we build power collectively and then take action for gender justice here in the city of Philadelphia? Whether or not that's in our schools as educators working on consent, to supporting anti-gentrification efforts that affect survivors of domestic violence, other marginalized and vulnerable groups, to harm reduction efforts of supporting drug users and sex workers and other vulnerable populations that are a part of the larger gender justice movement. And one of the things that we're really excited about that's happening with this next round of the SOCHA program is we're really centering and trying to structure and model accountability into the program, which looks like adding a grassroots fundraising component to it. And so this is inspired by the work of Bread and Roses, a nonprofit here in Philadelphia, and in partnership with Farrah Parks and the New Century Trust, which is a community fund that's resourcing the gender justice movement. All of the folks that are in the program will get skilled up in how to do grassroots fundraising and then be tasked with going back into their communities and having one-on-one conversations with men and other folks around raising money and moving resources and power through New Century Trust into consent-based education initiatives here in the city of Philadelphia. And they're going to be asked to raise $75,000 actually, because we want people to be having conversations and building relationships, and we want to have some receipts for this as well. And that's a really tangible ask that we can make for men who have traditionally more access to power, resource, other folks with those things, to begin transforming power and shifting shifting and resourcing Black feminist visionary leadership around gender justice here in the city.
So how do people get involved? Who they contact? Do we have a phone number, a website where people that's probably watching this? We inviting everybody that's watching this to reach out and get involved. This could be an opportunity for y'all to learn how to fundraise in grassroots situations.
Yeah, absolutely. And just in terms of how to get involved and find out more about our work, you can follow Lutheran Settlement House on Facebook. You can go to our website, and we have a whole page dedicated to the Masculinity Action Project that has information around some of the workshops we can offer for you and your groups, to some of the articles that has been written about the programs that we have offered, as well as the experience of men in the last cohort of the SOCHA program. And yeah, people can feel free to reach out to me. My number is 215-485-2608 if they just want to talk about any and all of this work, as well as figure out other ways to get involved. Because for folks that are interested in the SOCHA program, we're hoping to have all the application process is going to be closing December 20th. So if you want to apply, get an application to us before then, or at least get in touch with me. And also we'll be having lots of other programming and other ways to engage men or get involved in this community and work together.
Is there a fee that anybody have to pay to get involved?
All of our work is free. As far as the SOCHA program, there is that fundraising component, and participants are asked to provide, as part of that $75,000 pot, a self-identified meaningful contribution. So in Bread and Roses cohorts in the past, that's looked like anything from $50 to $30,000. It's really self-identified, but outside of that, like the food, the books, the other things are all covered and free, and all of our services are free. Yeah.
I would just say that we need to get more males that are proud to be feminists. And I'm just reflecting back to a class that I teach, race, ethnicity, and criminal justice, and there's a assignment I give called Understanding Prejudice, and there's a survey attached to it. And one of the questions, do you consider yourself to be a feminist? And how many of the male students say yes? It's very small. And it's almost as if they're embarrassed, or it's socially unacceptable to talk about that, or there's something negative associated with feminism in their heads. So we need to really change that and turn that upside down. And that's just, we're talking mainly about mainstream middle class males here, reflecting that there's something wrong with that term, or there's something threatening about that. I guess the word would be threatening.
Yeah. Threatening, even toxic masculinity is a threatening and uncomfortable term for a lot of folks. And there's some really deep questions that we in men's work and in the gender justice movement need to figure out, because there are a lot of dispossessed and alienated, young men of all racial backgrounds that see feminism as a dirty word and feel alienated. And the ways in which that they're finding community and connection is through folks like Jordan Peterson or Joe Rogan that become on boards to fascist ideologies and violent, racist, alt-right thinking, right? So our work is trying to figure out how feminism isn't just empowering for women, transgender, oppressed folks, but how men can see feminism as empowering and ways for them to live into wholly liberated and human relationships for themselves, and a good thing for them. So
exactly.
And Bell Hooks has a lot of really incredible, as well as so many other Black feminists and other feminist writers around some of the thinking there. So, yeah.
Excellent. Yeah.
Anything else that? But I just want to tell the people out there that's watching, man, it's all right to come out your comfort zone, out that box, and try something different. It don't make you a different person. You're still the same person. If you have sisters, mothers, daughters, then you need to think about twice about embracing toxic masculinity and acting like it's cool. Because as soon as somebody hit one of our daughters and sisters, we go crazy. When somebody else do it to us. But what about when we do it to somebody else? How the other person's people feel? We need to consider that.
Yeah. And as much as I'm concerned about my daughters and my sisters and my mothers, and what happens to them from the violence of toxic masculinity, I'm just as concerned about what happens to my sons and my brothers and my fathers that have gotten them there in the first place, because the ways in which that violence happens is nothing short of as the destruction of our own humanity.
Right. I believe that there comes a time when we have to break that cycle of trauma and decide that we can no longer pass this intergenerational trauma to our loved ones.
Yeah.
There got to be a stop.
Yeah.
So we want to thank everybody for tuning in. We hope that Richie come back. Maybe if y'all wanted, we could do a show every month dealing with this subject. And maybe some of y'all could come on the show and tell us how y'all feel. Whether you disagree or not, you're welcome to come. Let's have a conversation, because that's the only way we're going to have a breakthrough. Thanks for listening. Shout out to Westchester University, our chief sponsors, Richie, French Center, the Center down 40th Market, and everybody that's really trying hard to educate our community and help brothers and sisters coming home from prison choose a different way of life. Shout out to Usala. Our show is produced by Dylan. Our music is by Moby. And our show is sponsored, once again, by Westchester University. You listening to A Justice Conversation.
Thanks for having me, y'all.
Thanks for coming over.